My name is Eleanor Hale. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been a primary school teacher in Manchester. If you ask the people who know me how they describe me, most of them would probably use words like steady, sensible, or easygoing. I'm the kind of person people trust to keep things running quietly in the background. The one who remembers birthdays, the one who organizes things when nobody else notices they need organizing. I've never been the loudest person in a room, and to be honest, I never really tried to be. There's a certain comfort in being underestimated. People tend to assume that if you're calm, you must also be passive. If you don't argue, they assume you agree. And if you wait patiently long enough, they assume you'll wait forever. For many years, that assumption shaped my marriage. When my husband Daniel and I first talked about our future, there was one promise that felt simple and certain. We would eventually move closer to my family. My parents lived several hours away, and the idea was always that once things settled, once work was stable, once the timing was right, we would build our life somewhere nearer to them. It never sounded like a complicated promise, just something that would happen eventually. But years have a quiet way of accumulating. 1 year turns into 3, then 5, then 10. And every time the subject came up, Daniel had a perfectly reasonable explanation for why the move needed to wait a little longer. A promotion is coming soon, a better housing market next year, a project that couldn't be abandoned halfway through. Individually, none of those reasons seemed unreasonable, but 15 years is a long time to keep postponing the same promise. Eventually, I began to wonder whether the promise had ever truly existed, or if it had simply been something comforting to say at the beginning of a marriage. This story isn't about revenge, and it isn't about shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. It's about something quieter than that. It's about what happens when someone who has spent years being patient begins to look more closely at the life they're living and the promises that shaped it. And sometimes, the most significant changes don't happen in loud moments. They happen in silence. So, before I begin, I want to ask you something simple. Have you ever slowly realized that a promise someone made to you might never have been real? For most of our marriage, I had a very clear role in Daniel's life. Not one we ever discussed directly, but one that everyone seemed to understand. I was the reliable one, the person who kept things smooth, the one who made sure problems didn't become crises, the one who quietly handled the thousand small responsibilities that make a household function. If something needed remembering, I remembered it. If something needed organizing, I organized it. If something needed patience, that was usually my responsibility too. From the outside, it probably looked like a very calm marriage. Daniel worked in property development, which meant his schedule was unpredictable. Some weeks, he was home early, relaxed and talkative. Other weeks, he seemed to live inside his phone, answering messages even during dinner. Whenever friends asked about it, I usually said the same thing. He's just busy right now. And that was true in a way, but over time, right now became the permanent explanation for everything, especially the move. The first few years of our marriage felt hopeful. Daniel talked often about the future we were building. He liked planning things in broad strokes, what kind of house we'd eventually buy, what neighborhood might be nice, how we'd design a garden someday. When I mentioned living closer to my parents, he always agreed easily. Of course, he'd say, it makes sense long term. The phrase long term came up a lot. At the time, it felt reassuring, like we were both working toward the same destination, even if the timing wasn't immediate. My parents lived near the coast in Northumberland, about 4 hours away. Growing up there had been quiet and peaceful in a way cities rarely are. My mother still worked part-time at a local library, and my father spent most mornings walking along the same stretch of beach he'd walked since before I was born. Every time Daniel and I visited them, something inside me relaxed. The air felt slower there, and every visit ended the same way. We'll move closer eventually, Daniel would say to them casually over dinner. My parents always smiled politely, the way people do when they don't want to seem demanding. "Oh, there's no rush," my mother would reply, but there was always a warmth in her voice when she said it. I think she believed him. So did I, at least in the beginning, because Daniel wasn't cruel. He wasn't dismissive in the obvious ways people expect when they hear stories about difficult marriages. He never raised his voice. He didn't insult me. And he wasn't the kind of person who broke promises loudly. Instead, he had a much quieter skill. He postponed them, and every time he did, the explanation sounded reasonable enough that I felt almost foolish questioning it. Early in our marriage, I believed patience was part of being supportive. If your partner was working hard, you gave them time. If circumstances weren't ideal, you waited for the right moment. That seemed fair. So whenever the conversation about moving closer to my family came up, I never pushed very hard. I trusted that eventually the timing would align the way Daniel always said it would. Looking back now, I realized something subtle about those early years. Everyone in Daniel's life seemed to view me in the same way he did: dependable, reasonable, understanding. His colleagues liked me because I never complained about his long hours. His friends described me as easy to be around. Even his parents once told me they appreciated how calm I was, compared to some of the more dramatic partners they'd seen in their social circle. At the time, those comments sounded like compliments. But there was something hidden inside them, too, an assumption that I would always adapt, always wait, always understand. And when someone quietly fills that role for long enough, people begin to believe it's simply who they are, not a choice, just a personality. What none of them realized was that patience isn't infinite. Sometimes it's simply quiet, and quiet things can last a very long time before anyone notices they're beginning to change. The first moment that stayed with me didn't feel important at the time. In fact, if someone else had been there, they might not have noticed it at all. It happened about 3 years into our marriage, during a Sunday dinner at Daniel's parents' house. His family liked traditions: the same meals, the same seating arrangement, the same conversations that circled familiar topics: property markets, holidays people were planning, renovations someone had started. Daniel's mother, Margaret, prided herself on hosting those dinners. She set the table with careful precision, the kind that made you slightly nervous about placing your glass in the wrong spot. That evening started like all the others. We arrived with a bottle of wine. Daniel greeted his father with a handshake that quickly turned into a conversation about work. I helped Margaret in the kitchen while she finished preparing the roast. She asked polite questions about my class at school. "How are the children this year?" she said while stirring gravy. "Very energetic," I replied with a small laugh. "But lovely." Margaret smiled in the same gentle way she always did, though there was something faintly distant about it. Teachers, in her mind, were kind but slightly small in ambition, respectable, but not particularly impressive. I had sensed that from the beginning. Still, it didn't bother me much. Dinner moved along smoothly. The conversation shifted from work to travel plans. Daniel's sister mentioned that she and her husband were considering relocating to Edinburgh. That word, relocating, caught my attention immediately. I glanced toward Daniel. He didn't notice. His father leaned forward with interest. "Edinburgh's lovely. A bit expensive, though." His sister shrugged. "It might be worth it. We'd be closer to Tom's parents." The conversation flowed naturally around the table after that, people discussing distances, job opportunities, and school districts. At some point, Margaret turned toward Daniel and asked casually, "Have you two ever thought about moving somewhere else?" For a moment, I felt a flicker of recognition. This was the conversation we'd had many times privately. Moving closer to my family. Daniel didn't hesitate when he answered. "Oh, Eleanor likes the idea," he said lightly, carving a piece of chicken. "But it doesn't really make sense for my work." It was a small sentence, delivered casually, almost absent-mindedly. But it landed strangely in the room. Margaret nodded as if the matter had been clarified. "Yes, that makes sense," she said. Daniel's father murmured something about how Manchester was better for business anyway. The conversation moved on. No one paused. No one looked at me. And for a few seconds, I sat there quietly trying to understand what had just happened. Because that wasn't the promise Daniel and I had discussed for years. We hadn't talked about whether we would move. We had always talked about when. Yet somehow, in that brief moment at the dinner table, the story had changed. Now it sounded like the idea belonged only to me, a preference, not a shared plan. I remember looking down at my plate, adjusting my fork slightly, pretending to be focused on my food, not because I felt angry, more because I felt confused. It would have been easy to interrupt, to say something simple like, "Actually, we both talked about it." But the moment had already passed. The conversation had drifted somewhere else. Everyone seemed comfortable with the explanation Daniel had given. Correcting him suddenly would have felt awkward. So I said nothing. And that was the first small cut. Not painful enough to start an argument, just sharp enough that I remembered it later. Because something subtle had shifted in that moment. Daniel hadn't exactly lied. but he had quietly repositioned the promise, and no one in the room, not even me, challenged it. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter, but small moments have a way of revealing patterns long before we're ready to see them. After that dinner, I didn't bring it up immediately, partly because I wasn't certain it mattered, and partly because it felt too small to justify a serious conversation. Marriage, after all, is full of minor misunderstandings. People phrase things poorly. They simplify stories when speaking to others. I told myself that Daniel had probably just chosen the easiest explanation at the moment. That was reasonable. At least that's what I believed then. But something about the pattern began to repeat. Not dramatically, never in ways that looked intentionally cruel, just small adjustments to the story. A few months later, we attended a friend's birthday gathering. It was one of those crowded evenings in a restaurant where everyone talks a little too loudly and conversations overlap across the table. At some point, someone asked about long-term plans. It was the kind of question people ask couples casually. "Do you see yourselves staying in Manchester forever?" Daniel answered before I had time to think. "Probably," he said with a relaxed smile. "Eleanor's family lives further away, but she's used to that now." The table nodded politely. The conversation moved on to something else. But again, the sentence stayed with me. "She's used to that now." I remember the exact feeling that passed through me then. Not anger, not even disappointment. More like the quiet realization that the promise we once shared was slowly being rewritten into something that belonged only to me. And I kept allowing it to happen. That was the part I didn't examine closely at the time. Because confronting those moments would have required me to create discomfort in rooms where everyone else was comfortable. And I had spent most of my life learning how to avoid doing that. So instead, I did what many reasonable people do when faced with small, confusing signals. I rationalized them. Daniel worked extremely hard. His career had grown steadily over the years. Promotions came with bigger responsibilities, longer hours, and more people relying on him. It made sense that moving cities would complicate things. And technically, he had never said we wouldn't move. He simply kept explaining why the timing wasn't right. When I brought the subject up privately, he always responded with the same calm logic. "Eleanor, we just need to be patient," he would say. "It's not the right moment yet." And every explanation sounded practical enough that questioning it began to feel almost unreasonable. Still, something subtle had changed inside our conversations. In the early years, when we talked about moving closer to my parents, Daniel spoke as if it were part of our shared future. But gradually, the language shifted. "It's important to you," he would say. Or sometimes, "I understand why you'd like that." The difference was small, but it mattered, because the plan had quietly become my idea, my preference, my wish, and once something is framed that way, it becomes much easier for the other person to postpone it indefinitely. Looking back now, I realize how quietly that shift happened. No arguments, no firm refusals, just gentle delays and subtle reframing. And because nothing seemed dramatic enough to protest, I continued playing the role everyone expected from me. Understanding, reasonable, patient. It's strange how quickly people become comfortable with a version of you that asks for very little. Once they believe that's who you are, they stop questioning it entirely. And the truth is, I helped create that expectation. Every time I chose silence instead of clarification, every time I accepted a postponed conversation, every time I told myself it wasn't important enough to address, I was teaching everyone around me something. My patience had no limit. What I didn't yet understand was that patience isn't the same thing as agreement. Sometimes it's simply the time someone spends quietly observing. An observation, when it lasts long enough, eventually leads to clarity. There's a quiet moment in many long relationships when you begin to see the role other people expect you to play, not the role you consciously chose, the one that slowly formed around you. For me, that realization arrived gradually. Like noticing the shape of a room you've lived in for years, but never really examined. In Daniel's life, I had become something very specific. I was stable, not in the romantic sense people describe in films, not the dramatic partner who challenges or transforms someone, something quieter. I was the person who made everything easier. Daniel's career grew steadily during our marriage. His responsibilities increased, and so did the number of people depending on him: investors, colleagues, clients. His phone rarely stopped buzzing, and the more demanding his work became, the more valuable it seemed that his home life required almost nothing from him. I handled most of the practical details of our life without making them visible. Bills were paid, appointments were scheduled, birthdays were remembered. If Daniel needed something, documents, travel arrangements, a reminder about an event, it was usually already prepared. He often thanked me for it in a sincere but casual way. "You keep everything running," he'd say, and I did. But somewhere along the way, something subtle happened. Efficiency began to replace presence. Because when someone becomes very good at carrying responsibilities quietly, people stop noticing the effort involved. It simply becomes the expected background of life. Daniel didn't ask how often I drove 4 hours to visit my parents alone. He didn't ask what it felt like returning to Manchester after those weekends, leaving them standing in the doorway watching my car disappear down the road. Not because he didn't care, but because the system we'd built never required him to think about it. In his mind, everything was working, and in many ways, it was. We didn't fight. We didn't raise our voices. Our home was calm, organized, and predictable. From the outside, it probably looked like a very successful marriage, but calm and balanced aren't always the same thing. There were evenings when Daniel came home late, dropped his bag by the door, and spoke for 20 minutes straight about work without once asking how my day had been. Not out of cruelty, simply out of habit. And I listened, because that had quietly become my role too. The listener, the one who absorbed the day so someone else could unload theirs. Even among our friends, the dynamic was clear. If plans needed organizing, people often looked to me. If Daniel canceled at the last minute because work ran late, everyone accepted it easily. "He's always busy," someone would say, and then someone else would add, almost automatically, "but Eleanor's very understanding." At first, I felt proud of that description. Understanding sounded generous, mature, supportive. But eventually, I began to hear something else hidden inside it, an assumption that I would always adjust my expectations to fit everyone else's priorities, that my needs, whatever they were flexible, optional. The person who notices these patterns first is often the one living inside them, but recognizing a role and changing it are two very different things. For a long time, I continued playing mine, because the role itself wasn't cruel. It was comfortable, predictable, and most importantly, it avoided conflict. But the longer someone stays inside a role that doesn't quite belong to them, the more quietly something begins to shift. Not anger, not resentment. Something quieter than that. Awareness. And awareness, once it arrives, has a way of making the familiar feel slightly different. The moment everything began to change didn't happen during an argument. In fact, Daniel and I weren't even in the same room. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in early autumn, about 12 years into our marriage. The kind of day when the air is cool, but the sunlight still feels gentle enough to sit by a window with a cup of tea. Daniel had gone into the city to meet a colleague. I stayed home, grading reading assignments from my students. My living room was scattered with small exercise books filled with careful handwriting and misspelled attempts at complicated words. I remember feeling calm, ordinary. At some point, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice sounded cheerful at first, but slightly tired in the way people try to hide. We spoke about familiar things: her garden, a new volunteer who had started helping at the library, a neighbor who had adopted an energetic dog that barked at everything that moved. Then she mentioned something casually. "Oh, your father had another appointment this week," she said. I paused with my pen in midair. "What kind of appointment?" "Just routine tests," she replied quickly. "The doctor wants to keep an eye on his heart." She said it lightly, but there was something careful in her tone. The kind of carefulness people use when they don't want to worry someone they love. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time looking at the page in front of me without reading the words. It wasn't shocking news. My father was in his 70s. Medical appointments were a normal part of getting older. But the distance between us suddenly felt very real. 4 hours of driving. 4 hours if the traffic was kind. 4 hours between the people who had raised me and me. And in that quiet living room, something occurred to me with a clarity that surprised me. For 15 years, I had been waiting for the right moment to move closer to them. Waiting for the timing to become convenient enough for Daniel's work. Waiting for the future we had once talked about so easily. But time had not been waiting. My parents were getting older, whether our plans changed or not. I remember walking slowly into the kitchen and standing by the window. The street outside looked exactly the same as it always did. a couple walking a dog. A neighbor is loading groceries from his car. Nothing dramatic, yet the thought that came to me felt strangely final. If nothing changes, this is simply how the rest of my life will look. Occasional long drives, short visits, phone calls fill the spaces that physical presence might have occupied. Daniel returned home an hour later. He kissed my cheek, dropped his keys into the bowl by the door, and immediately began telling me about a potential investment project his company was considering. I listened the way I always did, calmly, attentively, but something inside me had shifted while he was gone. For the first time in many years, I stopped thinking about the move as a shared plan we were slowly approaching. Instead, I saw it as something that might never happen at all. Not because Daniel had refused, but because he had simply continued postponing it long enough that life had moved on around us. That afternoon, while he spoke about property developments and market trends, I realized something quiet but important. Waiting is a decision, even when it feels passive, even when it looks patient. And the moment you recognize that, you begin to understand something else. You are allowed to reconsider decisions you never consciously made. I didn't say anything to Daniel that evening, not because I was afraid, but because I had begun to understand something new about silence. Sometimes it is an avoidance. Sometimes it's the space where clarity forms. Before that afternoon, my silence had mostly been automatic, the kind that comes from habit, from wanting to keep conversations smooth, to avoid unnecessary tension, to maintain the quiet balance that seemed to define our marriage. But after my conversation with my mother, something about that silence changed. It stopped being passive. Instead, it became deliberate. For the first time, I began to observe Daniel more carefully, not in a suspicious way. I wasn't looking for evidence of wrongdoing or betrayal. I was simply paying attention to things I had previously accepted without thinking too much about them. How often he used the phrase, "not right now," how easily future plans became indefinite, and how naturally everyone around him assumed that his priorities were the ones that mattered most. Once you start noticing patterns, they become surprisingly clear. Daniel spoke about the future frequently, but always in ways that preserved the present exactly as it was. A larger project next year, a better opportunity is just around the corner, a more convenient moment that always seems slightly ahead of us. It wasn't manipulation in the dramatic sense people imagine. He believed what he was saying. That was part of why it worked so well. Still, the promise about moving closer to my parents had quietly faded from our everyday conversations. When it did appear, it surfaced briefly and then disappeared again behind practical explanations. A few weeks after that phone call with my mother, I mentioned my parents during dinner. "My father's doctor wants to monitor his heart," I said calmly. "Nothing urgent, but they're doing more regular checkups." Daniel nodded sympathetically. "That's normal at his age," he replied. "They'll keep an eye on it." Then he took another bite of his food and continued talking about a new commercial property his firm was acquiring. The subject of distance, the 4 hours between us, never entered the conversation. And this time, I didn't guide it there. That was the difference. Previously, I might have gently steered the discussion back toward our old plan. I might have said something like, "It would be easier if we lived closer," but instead, I simply listened. Because I had begun to understand something subtle about our marriage. Daniel believed our life was functioning exactly as it should. The system worked. He advanced professionally. Our home remained calm and supportive. I handled the quieter aspects of life without complaint. From his perspective, there was no reason to question the arrangement. And people rarely reconsider systems that appear to be working. So, I stopped trying to change it through conversation, not because I had given up, but because I had started thinking differently about time. For years, I had treated the promise of moving closer to my family as something that depended on Daniel's readiness. But that afternoon in my living room had introduced a new thought. What if the decision didn't actually belong to him? What if waiting had simply been the easiest path, not the only one? These weren't conclusions yet, just quiet questions. But questions have a powerful effect when you allow them to sit long enough. They shift how you interpret everyday moments. When Daniel postponed another weekend trip to visit my parents because he needed to attend a networking event, I didn't argue. When he said we should revisit the idea of relocating sometime in the future, I didn't remind him how many times we had already done that. Instead, I wrote something down later that evening in my navy blue notebook. Just one sentence. The promise still exists in memory, but not in practice. And that was the moment my silence truly became a choice, because silence can serve many purposes. Sometimes it protects peace. Sometimes it hides disappointment. But occasionally it becomes something far more useful: observation. And observation, when paired with patience, eventually leads to understanding. The interesting thing about being underestimated is that people eventually stop watching you closely. They assume they already understand who you are. In my case, everyone believed they knew my defining quality: patience. The calm teacher, the supportive wife, the reasonable person who rarely complicates things. Once that image settled in people's minds, it stayed there. And because of that, something else became possible. I could change quietly, not dramatically, not in ways that drew attention, just gradually enough that no one noticed the shift while it was happening. It started with small habits. After my father's appointment, I began visiting my parents slightly more often. Not every weekend, that would have raised questions, but often enough that I could observe how their lives were changing. My father still walked the beach most mornings, but the walks were shorter. And sometimes my mother joined him not because she particularly enjoyed the wind along the coast, but because she preferred not to let him go alone. I noticed things like that: the subtle adjustments people make as they age, the quiet ways independence begins to narrow. Meanwhile, back in Manchester, Daniel's world continued expanding. His projects grew larger, his professional network widened, invitations to industry events became more frequent. And because I had always been the organized one, it felt natural for me to manage our household finances. That responsibility had never been formally discussed. It had simply evolved over time. Daniel earned significantly more than I did, but I handled the practical side: tracking expenses, maintaining savings accounts, making sure everything remained orderly. At first, those tasks had been routine, but gradually I began approaching them with more curiosity. Not suspicion, just attention. I started keeping clearer records than before: dates, decisions, long-term financial structures, nothing secretive. Daniel had full access to everything, just as he always had, but I began documenting things more carefully in my notebook, particularly conversations about the future. When someone promises something repeatedly over many years, it becomes interesting to see how the wording changes. Sometimes Daniel said, "when things settle." Sometimes it became, "if the right opportunity appears." And occasionally the subject disappeared entirely for months at a time. I wrote those moments down, not because I planned to confront him with them, but patterns become visible when you see them arranged across time. Meanwhile, something else began to shift in my own thinking. For years, I had treated the possibility of moving closer to my parents as a shared decision that depended heavily on Daniel's career. But the more I observed our life, the clearer something became. Daniel's work would always provide another reason to stay. Not because he was deliberately avoiding the move, but ambition rarely reaches a point where it feels complete. There is always another project, another promotion, another opportunity just ahead. Waiting for the perfect moment meant waiting indefinitely. That realization changed how I approached the future. Instead of imagining one large decision, we move, I began examining fewer possibilities. Practical ones. What would it look like if I spent extended periods with my parents each year? What financial arrangements would allow that? How flexible was my own career if I ever wanted to adjust where I lived? These weren't plans yet, just questions. But questions, when asked quietly enough, can exist for a long time without attracting attention. Daniel noticed none of this. From his perspective, our life continued exactly as before. I still managed the house. I still listened when he talked about work. I still accompanied him to dinners with colleagues where people described me as calm and supportive. Nothing outwardly had changed. But internally, I had begun doing something different. I was preparing. Not for confrontation, not for an argument, just for the possibility that one day I might need to make a decision independently. And when you begin preparing quietly, you gain something valuable: clarity. Because distance, emotional or physical, often reveals truths that daily routines hide. The more carefully I observed our life, the more one realization settled gently into place. Daniel hadn't intentionally broken a promise, but he had learned something over the years: that postponing it worked just as well. And the reason it worked was simple: I had never truly challenged it. But preparation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's simply the quiet gathering of information. And the strange thing about information is that eventually, it leads you somewhere you didn't originally expect. The moment of clarity didn't arrive like a dramatic discovery. There was no hidden document, no secret conversation overheard in the wrong place. Instead, it came during one of the most ordinary activities in our household, reviewing finances. It was something I did every few months, usually on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Daniel was out meeting colleagues or attending industry events. I'd sit at the dining table with my laptop, our bank statements, and the navy blue notebook where I kept track of longer-term plans. For years, this process had been routine. Income in one column, expenses in another, savings allocated toward investments or property. Daniel trusted me to handle it because I was organized and because numbers never particularly interested him unless they involved business deals. That afternoon, however, I approached the task differently, not with suspicion, just curiosity. I began reviewing the long-term investments Daniel had gradually built over the years, funds tied to property development projects, shares in smaller ventures he had joined with colleagues, retirement accounts designed to grow steadily over decades. Everything looked stable, successful, even. But one detail caught my attention. Nearly every major financial structure we had was deeply tied to Manchester. The property investments were local. The partnerships he maintained relied heavily on his physical presence. Even some of the retirement planners assumed he would continue operating within the same professional network. At first glance, that made sense. His career had developed here. But as I examined the details more closely, something became clear. Moving to another region, even within the same country, would complicate much of this structure. Don't ruin it, but certainly disrupt it, and Daniel knew that. I sat there quietly, scrolling through documents, noticing how each decision over the years had slowly strengthened those local ties. Individually, every choice looked practical. Investing close to where you work is logical. Building networks within the same city is efficient. Remaining physically available for opportunities increases success. All of it made sense. But together, those choices created something else, an anchor, one that grew heavier every year. And suddenly I understood something that had been invisible before. Daniel hadn't simply postponed the move. He had gradually built a life that made moving increasingly unlikely, not through a single decision, through many small ones. The realization didn't make me angry. In fact, the feeling that arrived first was something closer to clarity. Because once you see the structure of a situation, it becomes much easier to understand everyone's behavior inside it. Daniel wasn't lying when he said moving would be difficult. By now, it truly was. But difficulty and impossibility aren't the same thing. I closed my laptop and sat for a while without moving. Outside, I could hear distant traffic and the occasional sound of someone walking past the house. And in that quiet moment, another thought arrived. If Daniel's life had slowly anchored itself to Manchester, then the only person whose future still remained flexible was me. I had always seen our lives as one shared structure that required both of us to shift together. But that wasn't entirely true. My career as a teacher existed almost everywhere. My financial responsibilities were organized and manageable. And most importantly, my parents' lives were changing in ways that didn't wait for convenient timing. The leverage I had discovered wasn't financial. It was something much simpler: freedom of movement. For 15 years, I had assumed the decision about where we lived belonged equally to both of us. But what I realized that afternoon was different. Daniel had been making decisions about location all along, just indirectly. And the only reason it had worked so smoothly was that I had been waiting for him to finish deciding. That understanding didn't create urgency. It created calm. Because once you recognize the true structure of a situation, you stop arguing with it. You start planning around it instead. I opened my notebook again and wrote another sentence beneath the last one. He built a life that can't easily move. Then, after a moment, I added a second line. But I never promised to stay still forever. And that was the private reveal. Not something anyone else noticed. Just a quiet shift in perspective. The kind that slowly changes what decisions look like when they finally arrive. After that afternoon, I didn't rush into action. For several weeks, life continued exactly as it always had. Daniel left early for work, returned home talking about meetings and projects, and our evenings followed their familiar rhythm. From the outside, nothing had changed. but internally, something important had settled. For the first time in years, I stopped thinking about waiting. Instead, I began thinking about choosing. One evening, I drove to visit my parents again. The journey felt strangely different that time, even though the road was the same. 4 hours north. Motorways are giving way to quieter coastal roads. My mother greeted me at the door with the same warm smile she always had, but I noticed how carefully she moved when carrying a tray of tea into the living room. My father seemed well. He joked about the doctor's instructions and insisted the heart tests were mostly boredom, disguised as medicine. Still, I could see the subtle change in him. Not weakness exactly, just age. Later that evening, after my parents had gone to bed, I sat alone in their small kitchen. The house was quiet in the way only long-lived homes can be, wood creaking softly, wind brushing against the windows. And in that quiet space, the situation in my life felt unusually clear. There were several possible paths in front of me. I could continue exactly as things were, drive back and forth when I had time, visit when Daniel's schedule allowed it, wait for the moment when moving might become convenient enough to revisit the conversation again. That path required no disruption. It also required no change. Another option was confrontation. I could sit down with Daniel and insist that the promise be addressed directly. We could debate the practical obstacles, argue about timing, and negotiate compromises. But I knew something about Daniel. He wasn't someone who responded well to ultimatums. Confrontation would only create resistance. And then there was the third option, the one that had quietly formed in my mind over the previous weeks. Not dramatic, not hostile, simply irreversible. A decision about how I would live the next chapter of my life, regardless of whether Daniel's plans changed. I sat there for a long time thinking about it. Not with anger, just with a calm kind of certainty. Because sometimes the most difficult part of a decision isn't choosing the path. It's admitting that the decision belongs to you. When I finally stood up from the kitchen table that night, I had already made it. Daniel just didn't know yet. Once the decision was made, the most important thing was not speed. It was quiet. Not secrecy in a dramatic sense. There was nothing illegal or deceptive about what I was doing. But decisions that change the shape of a life often unfold best when they aren't announced too early. People tend to react emotionally before they understand what's actually happening, and I wasn't interested in emotional reactions. I was interested in clarity. The first step was practical. At school, I scheduled a meeting with the head teacher. I had worked there for more than a decade, so the conversation was comfortable and respectful. I'm not resigning, I explained gently, but I may need some flexibility in the coming year, possibly an extended leave or a transfer if an opportunity arises. Teachers move between schools more often than people realize. The system allows for adjustments, temporary placements, sabbaticals, changes in hours. Nothing I asked for was unusual. The head teacher nodded thoughtfully. Family reasons? She asked. Yes, I said simply. That was enough explanation. The second step was financial. Because I had managed our accounts for years, I already understood the structure of our savings. Everything was transparent, balanced, and legally shared. But I began organizing my portion with more independence. A personal account that could comfortably support a second residence if necessary, clear documentation of investments and contributions, a careful record of everything we own jointly. Again, nothing secretive, just preparation. The third step was location. During one of my visits to my parents, I spent an afternoon walking through the small town nearby. The streets looked exactly as I remembered from childhood. Narrow lanes, quiet cafes, the same bakery that had existed for decades. But this time I noticed something new. A small primary school near the library where my mother volunteered. Teachers are always curious about other schools. I stepped inside out of simple professional interest and spoke briefly with the administrator at the front desk. We talked about class sizes, curriculum, and the challenges of rural education. By the time I left, I had also learned something else. They occasionally needed experienced teachers for mid-year placements when staff relocated or took maternity leave. I thanked them and walked back toward my parents' house slowly, feeling the sea wind moving across the streets. For years, that town had existed only in memory, a place connected to childhood, but suddenly it felt like a possible future. Meanwhile, back in Manchester, Daniel noticed none of this. Our routines continued exactly as before. He talked about upcoming projects, potential investments, and dinners with clients. I listened calmly, asked thoughtful questions, and continued organizing the practical details of our life together. From his perspective, nothing had changed. That was the quiet advantage of moving slowly. People rarely question stability. If the surface of a life looks calm, they assume the structure underneath remains the same. But structures can shift long before anyone notices. Sometimes foundations are already being rearranged, while the house above still appears perfectly still. One evening, Daniel mentioned an upcoming industry conference that would take him abroad for nearly 2 weeks. Good opportunity for networking, he said casually. I smiled and nodded. That sounds promising. Inside, I felt an unexpected sense of calm, because his absence would give me something valuable: time. Not to act impulsively, just to take the next quiet step in a process that had already begun. And the most interesting thing about silent movement is this: by the time others realize something has changed, the decision has usually been in motion for quite a while. Daniel left for the conference on a Monday morning. He kissed my cheek near the front door, checked that he had his passport, and reminded me that the trip might extend a day or two if meetings ran longer than expected. All right, I said calmly. Nothing about the moment felt unusual. After he left, the house became very quiet. I made tea, sat at the dining table, and opened my notebook. For a few minutes, I simply looked around the room. The furniture, the framed photographs, the small routines that had defined our life for so many years. Then I began making phone calls. First, to the school near my parents' town. They did, in fact, need a teacher for a mid-year placement starting in a few months. Temporary at first, but potentially longer if it worked well. The conversation was professional and straightforward. Second, I contacted a small property agency in the same town. Not to buy anything immediately, just to ask about long-term rentals, something modest, something flexible. By the end of that afternoon, two quiet things had happened: a possible job and a possible place to live. Neither decision was final yet, but they existed now in the real world, not just in my thoughts. Over the following weeks, I continued living exactly as before. Daniel returned from his trip enthusiastic about new opportunities. Our evenings remained calm, our conversations familiar, yet small shifts had begun to appear, though Daniel didn't recognize them as shifts. I visited my parents a little more often. I organized certain documents more carefully. I adjusted my schedule at school in preparation for the possibility of change. From the outside, nothing dramatic was happening. But consequences rarely announce themselves loudly at first. They begin quietly, often as small absences: a weekend spent somewhere else, a conversation postponed, a routine that subtly rearranges itself. And the strange thing about these early consequences is that people feel them long before they understand them. Daniel began asking small questions. You're driving up north again this weekend? Yes, I replied gently, just for a few days. He nodded. No concern, no suspicion, just mild curiosity, because the life we had built together still looked stable. But stability can sometimes be the final stage before change becomes visible. And by then, it's usually too late to return things to the way they were. The moment Daniel realized something had changed came later than I expected. Not because I was hiding anything, but because people often interpret change in the simplest possible way first. For several weeks, my visits to my parents became more frequent. Sometimes long weekends, sometimes a few extra days when my schedule allowed it. Daniel noticed, of course, but he interpreted it the way he had always interpreted things in our marriage. Eleanor is understanding. Eleanor is patient. Eleanor adapts. So when I packed a bag one Thursday evening, he only glanced up from his laptop. Heading up tomorrow? He asked. Yes, I said. Back Sunday? Probably Monday. He nodded and returned to his screen. At that point, my arrangements with the school near my parents' town were already confirmed. The temporary teaching position would begin at the start of the next term. I had also signed a lease for a small cottage about 10 minutes from my parents' house. Nothing extravagant. Just 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and windows that faced the sea. The property agent had described it as quiet but comfortable. That sounded perfect to me. Still, I hadn't told Daniel yet. Not because I intended to surprise him dramatically, but because I wanted to speak once the decision was complete, not while it was still forming. People tend to argue with possibilities. They react differently to realities. The evening the conversation finally happened was completely ordinary. Daniel came home late from work, dropped his keys in the bowl by the door, and loosened his tie while walking into the kitchen. "Long day," he said. I was making tea. He sat down at the table and began describing a development project his firm was negotiating, the kind of conversation I had heard many times before. Details about investors, timelines, and potential profits. I listened quietly until he finished. Then I placed his cup in front of him and sat across the table. "I've accepted a teaching position near my parents," I said calmly. Daniel blinked. The sentence seemed to land in the room like something unfamiliar. "What do you mean?" he asked. "It starts next term," I explained. "I've arranged a small place to stay there." For a few seconds, he simply stared at me. The confusion on his face was genuine. "You're moving?" he said slowly. "Part of the time," I replied. "Yes, Jay." Silence filled the kitchen. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, trying to process what I had just told him. "But we never decided that," he said. His voice wasn't angry, just unsettled. And that was the moment I realized something important. In his mind, the decision about moving had always been postponed. Not denied, not accepted, just suspended indefinitely. He had assumed it would remain that way. "What about my work?" he asked after a moment. "You'll still be here," I said gently. "Your projects are in Manchester." "That's not what I mean." "I know." He rubbed his forehead, thinking. "You should have talked to me first," he said eventually. I looked at him quietly for a moment before answering. "I did," I said. "Many times." Daniel opened his mouth slightly as if to respond, but nothing came out. Suddenly, the past 15 years were sitting between us at the kitchen table. Not as an argument, just as a timeline. And timelines have a way of making certain things clear. The truth was simple. The decision he thought we still needed to make had already been made slowly over many years, just not by both of us. Daniel didn't raise his voice. That was one of the reasons our marriage had always appeared calm from the outside. He wasn't someone who exploded emotionally. When he was unsettled, he became quieter instead. That evening in the kitchen, he sat very still for a while, looking at the table as if the wood grain might help him organize his thoughts. "You're serious about this," he said eventually. "Yes." "And the job, the place, that's already arranged?" "It is." Another pause settled between us. I could see him retracing the last few weeks in his mind. My visits north, the small adjustments to my schedule, the extra bags packed for longer weekends. At the time, none of those things had seemed important. Now they are connected to something larger. "You should have told me earlier," he said again, though this time his voice carried less certainty. I shook my head slightly. "I told you what I needed many times," I replied. "This is just the first time I've acted on it." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. For years, Daniel had been the person making forward-moving decisions about work, investments, projects. I realized this might be the first major life change that had happened without his direction, and that disorientation was difficult for him. "So, what does this mean?" he asked after a moment. "It means I'll be spending more time near my parents," I said calmly. "They're getting older. I want to be present." "And us?" The question hung gently in the air. It wasn't accusatory, just uncertain. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "It means our life may look different from what it has," I said. Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that. "I always thought we'd figure the move out eventually," he said quietly. "I know. But things kept getting complicated." "I know that too." Another long silence followed. But it wasn't the tense kind of people that people imagine when they think about marital confrontations. There was no anger in the room, just recognition. Daniel looked up at me finally, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "You think I avoided it," he said. I considered the wording. "No," I replied gently. "I think you postponed it until it stopped feeling real." He didn't argue with that, because deep down, he probably understood it was true. Promises that live too long in the future eventually lose their shape. They become ideas rather than plans. And ideas are easy to delay. Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly. "I wish you'd said something sooner," he murmured. I gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. "I did," I said softly. And for a long time, waiting felt like the right thing to do. The room fell quiet again. Outside, a car passed along the street, its headlights briefly moving across the kitchen wall. Finally, Daniel asked the only question that still mattered. "When are you leaving?" Next month, I said. He nodded once, not in agreement, just in acceptance. Because some decisions don't arrive suddenly. They form gradually over the years. And by the time they're spoken aloud, the real turning point has already passed. A month later, I was standing in the small cottage by the sea, opening the windows to let the salt air move through the rooms. The house was simple: white walls, wooden floors, a narrow kitchen that looked out toward a quiet street where people walked slowly in the mornings. From the upstairs bedroom, you could see a thin line of gray-blue water on the horizon. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt right. My new routine settled in gradually. I began teaching at the small primary school nearby, where the classrooms were smaller, and the children arrived each morning with wind-tangled hair from the coast. In the afternoons, I often stopped by my parents' house. Sometimes my mother and I walked to the library together. Sometimes my father and I took slow walks along the beach, the same path he had followed for decades. For the first time in many years, distance was no longer something I had to calculate. Daniel and I still spoke. Our conversations were calm, careful, and respectful. He remained in Manchester, continuing the work he had built his life around. Occasionally, he visited for a weekend, walking through the quiet town with a kind of thoughtful curiosity. Neither of us pretended the situation was simple, but it was honest. And honesty, I realized, can feel surprisingly peaceful. People sometimes imagine that decisions like mine come from anger or resentment, but that wasn't what I felt. If anything, what replaced those long years of waiting was something quieter: clarity. For most of my adult life, I had been the person everyone described as patient, and I still was. The difference now was that my patience no longer meant staying still. It meant understanding when it was time to move. Looking back now, I don't think Daniel ever intended to break his promise. That's the strange thing about many long disappointments in life. They rarely come from cruelty. More often, they come from comfort. Comfort with the way things are. Comfort with postponing difficult decisions. Comfort with believing that the future will always provide another opportunity to do what we once said we would do. For 15 years, Daniel had reasons to delay our move, and to be fair, most of them were reasonable. But reasonable explanations can still lead to quiet consequences, because time doesn't pause while people are waiting for the right moment. Parents grow older, opportunities shift, and eventually, the life you imagined becomes a life you must decide whether to keep waiting for. For a long time, I believed patience meant trusting that someone else would eventually fulfill the promise they made. But I learned something different. Patience doesn't have to mean surrendering your future to someone else's timing. Sometimes patience simply means giving yourself enough time to understand what you truly need. And once you understand that clearly, the next step often becomes surprisingly calm, not dramatic, not angry, just necessary. Daniel and I still speak occasionally. There is no bitterness between us. Our lives simply moved in slightly different directions than the ones we imagined when we were younger. And perhaps that's the quiet truth about many relationships. Not every promise breaks in a single moment. Sometimes it fades slowly. And when that happens, the most powerful response isn't revenge or confrontation. It's clarity. So I'm curious about something. Have you ever waited years for a promise someone made, only to realize that the waiting itself had become the answer?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.